All right, perfect. All right. Perfect. So hi everybody, my name is Matt Bradley, and my talk today will be on the estimation of a player's trade value. After seeing the first two presentations, it's a lot less analytically specific, but it's more of a broad topic, but it's an interesting one that can be broken down and visualized to determine some very cool things. But before I get into that, let's talk about me for a bit. All right, so as I mentioned before, my name is Matt Bradley, and I am an 18-year-old living in Switzerland. There's a 9-hour time difference, which is the hardest part about living in Switzerland, just because I have to wake up at 1 a.m. for every single Flyers game. So it's hard on your sleep schedule, and if it's a close game, you can't go to bed after that. So anyways, I decided to move to Switzerland just to try something new. So yeah, I'm pretty much like Austin Matthews. Except unlike Austin, I'm less into playing hockey and more into analyzing it. So my interest in hockey analytics was prompted by the often puzzling performances of certain players and certain teams. Teams that on paper looked undefeatable, losing in the first or second round, like the Capitals, or prospects that looked promising and ended up fizzling out after the first couple of years. So for me, these hockey puzzles were dazzling, and so I made it my business for the last couple of years to try and crack these puzzles and put some predictability into determining a player's trade value. And so today, that's what I want to talk about. But that's enough talking about it. Let's actually get into it. All right, so I'm going to split this brief presentation into an even briefer 3 sections. Firstly, I'm going to show you how the spreadsheet is calculated with justifications for each category. And then next, I'm going to look at the results by quickly checking out the values for each player on every team. And then finally, we're going to test the model's accuracy by looking at some recent trades that have happened. The trade deadline just passed us, so that's convenient. All right, so how do I determine the actual player's trade value? So here it is. To determine a player's value, I use the combination of 10 differently weighted categories in addition to 3 bonus categories. The weightings are all subjective to what I personally think makes up a player's trade value, so just note that there's no mathematical statistical formula for this. With that being said, the categories have been meticulously crafted, revised, and perfected to make sure the trade values are as accurate as possible. So let's briefly examine how the value is generated for each category and then why it is there in the first place. All right, so to calculate the value for each category and then the total value is a relatively simple process. I was able to scrape the data from all the categories and compile it next to the corresponding player. Then, as you can see, I would have, for example, the category goals per 60 minutes. I would add a row titled value right to the right of it, and then I would simply find the percentile of that player's goals per 60 minutes compared to the rest of the defensemen, for Josh Manson, for example, in the NHL. I would then drag down that percentile for all the other defensemen in the NHL, as well as all the forwards. After this process of getting the percentile value for every category of every player, I was then able to determine the player's total value. And this was done simply by summing the weighted values together, i.e. adding the points per game value multiplied by 0.18 plus time on ice per game multiplied by 0.14 and so on and so forth. So now it's time to justify each of the categories and their weightings. So we're starting in ascending order with height. So it's weighted only at 2%. Look, the taller you are, the more value in principle you hold. If you were a GM and you were given the option between player A, random player A, 5'6", and random player B, 6'5", you'd be foolish to pick player A. But just how much of a correlation really is there between a player's height and their trade value? Well, truth be told, it's not a lot. As we can see, there's roughly an even number of short and valuable, short and tall, or short and valuable, tall and valuable, and tall and invaluable players in the NHL. So as such, I decided to recognize its importance, but appreciate through the data that it should only be weighted very slightly. Next up, we have even strength Corsi for relative weighted at 5%. And relative Corsi is a relatively simplistic way of measuring how effective a player is in driving possession in relation to the rest of the team. So I have offensive and defensive categories, but this one didn't really fit into either. Rather, it's a result of both offensive and defensive skill. So it goes without saying that there is a positive correlation between this stat and a player's value for 30 of the 31 teams. Dallas, on the other hand, has actually a negative correlation between Corsi for percentage, relative, and value. And this is mainly because of players like Jamie Benn, Matthias Janmark, and Tyler Seguin having a negative Corsi and still having high value. But still, the Corsi is simply a step that I could not leave off the value category, but it should not be weighted as greatly as the components ahead of it. So after that, we have primary and secondary assists weighted at 10% and 6% respectively. This is pretty self-explanatory as to why it needs to be included, so I'm not going to get into it all that much, but it makes sense that primary assists are weighted more than secondary assists, and you can see there's a positive correlation between the two stats. And then after that, we have defensive ability, and this was one of the trickiest factors for me in determining a player's value. At first, I tried the model without this category, and soon realized my mistake. Players like Couturier, Bergeron, Barkov, all these Selke candidates were valued far too low. What makes them so valuable is their ability to shut players out or shut players down rather than just help putting the puck in the back of the net. So I wanted to include a player's defensive skill, but for the longest time was having trouble turning something so broad into just one stat, something objective. And then I came up with even strength defensive zone starts per 60 when leading by 1. And you can see here, for the most part, the more trusted, the better defensive zone players ended up having the more D-zone starts per 60 minutes. Went up by 1. You can see, I'll scroll down, you see Antoine Vermette, Patrice Bergeron, all these players that are good defensive players ended up leading in this category. Ryan O'Reilly, Jordan Staal, and so on and so forth. And then after that, we have contract. And similar to defensive ability, the contract category in my valuation, without it, it was tremendously skewed. So one of the biggest factors when considering a trade is the value of that contract. Now I put an emphasis on value because it's not just the dollar amount, but rather it's a combined metric. So what I did was I took the contract dollar amount, divided it by points per game, and then divided it once again by time on ice. This way their contract was more proportional to their actual on-ice product. So for example, Tavares' contract should not be worth less than Matt Martin simply because he's paid a few $1 million more. Using a combined metric, guys like Tavares, Simmons, Seguin, and other higher paid players actually have a top third in the league contract value compared to a bottom third without this combined metric. So we can briefly look at some of the other players on good value contracts that are above 22 passer ELCs. So needless to say, players' contract value is an important addition to any trade model, and here's no exception. All right, so after that we have age, and that's of course a given when talking about a player's trade value, so I won't get into it all that much. Obviously, as a player gets older, their value decreases, and this remains consistent with my data over here. After that, we have time on ice per game, and this is sort of an overarching category here. Not only does it have a positive correlation to all the on-ice categories, but it's a teller of a coach's trust in a player and a player's ability to eat up valuable minutes. Players like Weber, Provorov, and Landeskog don't all put up absurd numbers, but they are in the 95th and above percentile for time on ice amongst their position, and they need to be valued greatly for that. If Provorov, for example, played second or third pairing minutes like Robert Hagg does, he would drop from the top 20 most valuable into just barely the top 50. So it's an essential part of the game, an essential factor into my value weightings. Next up, we have goals per 60 minutes, and I sort of just touched on this, but I chose per 60 as opposed to per game because I also have a category for time on ice, so this is just purely their goal scoring ability when on the ice. The same thing applies to primary and secondary assists. Anyway, so this category is worth a little bit more than double secondary assists and 40% more than secondary assists, or double secondary and 40% more than primary assists, which I think is justified for itself. Goal scorers don't grow on trees, and they should be valued like they do. They are few and far between, and when teams do, should and will always have to pay up to get them. And you can see there's a strong correlation to goals per 60 minutes and a player's total value, but more on that in a second. And then finally, our final percentage is points per game in their career since 2010. First of all, anything before 2010 is essentially useless because the slight value that comes with having a marketable player, i.e. trading for Jaromir Jagr because it was pre-2010 points per game, is few and far between. Essentially, this stat makes sure that people having down years or people having really good years are not totally skewed in a proportion. For example, Crosby would be way lower on this ranking if not for his impressive and league-leading 1.25 points per game since 2010. Same thing with Couturier, he'd be a top 10 player if not for his 0.52 points per game since 2010. So this category essentially just tries to remove any outliers from the data set. People having amazing years are not totally boosted, or people having down years are not totally screwed. Although an imperfection with this is rookies, since their points per game is just their points this year, so Barzal is rated super high and Nolan Patrick is not, which is kind of an imperfection to this model. But anyways, this model also has 3 bonus categories that couldn't really be broken down into percentiles. First of all, we have draft position, and this is only a bonus added if the player is drafted since 2013 and drafted in the top 50. Again, these are kind of random numbers, but anybody drafted below 50th or before 2013 doesn't have any real value added. If a player does meet these requirements, the value added is a factorial of that draft position multiplied by 2. For example, Patrick Laine was drafted 2nd overall, so that's 1 over 2 multiplied by 2, that's 1, so he has 1 bonus point added. As such, it really only affects the people drafted right near the top of the draft. The next bonus category is captaincy, in which if you have an A, you get an additional half point, and if you have a C, you get an additional full point. A player with a letter on their jersey is inherently more valuable because they're a better leader, and that's certainly something to consider when trading for a player. And then the last bonus category is their physical position. A winger gets no bonus points, a center gets an additional half point, and a defenseman gets a full bonus point. This is based on the principle of supply and demand. Since defense are more limited and they play the more important position than, say, wingers, the price of that commodity is subsequently increased. All right, so you can see here that there is a positive correlation for almost all these categories. The first 4, points per game, time on ice per game, and goals and primary assists per 60 minutes, are very highly correlated to value. And then there's a big enough drop off to the point where we get to height where, as we talked about earlier, there's almost no correlation to value. And then this model is not without its imperfections. First of all, and this is consistent with any model, but not everything could be accounted for. Some things just can't be translated into a number. Leadership skills, for example, unless you're a captain or assistant captain, cannot be applied to this model. And then the biggest and most obvious omission, at least in my opinion, to this model is their contract length. The difference between trading for unrestricted free agent Tavares and Tavares signed for 3 more years is enormous, and something I did not manage to fit into this iteration of the model. And ideally, it would be a combined metric of both contract length as well as age, because in contrast to that Tavares example, trading for Gabrick at 36 with 3 years less is less valuable than trading for Gabrick at 36 with 1 year left. And then moreover, to the actual contract value data, players on entry-level contracts or players that have signed extensions that have not yet kicked in are unfairly valued too high. And then another obvious limitation is the injury data. I couldn't find a succinct source that let me scrape the data for just the number of man games lost for each player due to injury. I started to try to do it manually, but there were too many inconsistencies and inaccuracies for that. And then moreover, and this primarily pertains to defensemen, but certain players have playing styles that reduce their chance for offensive output. Defensive defensemen, for example, are undervalued in this model, despite the fact that I did value defensive ability and time on ice quite high. And then finally, goalies are not a part of this model, so we cannot compare their value to a player's value. Anyways, these were my main limitations when creating this player value model, but with that being said, let's check out some of the results. All right, so I'm gonna start by doing this in team groupings, and I'm just gonna scroll down. It's better with team groupings because it's seemingly more accurate when done this way. It helps put the player's value in perspective with regards to the rest of the team. And as I scroll down, you're inevitably gonna notice some players that are out of place. That's bound to happen thanks to the nature of the model and its bias towards this year. However, as mentioned before, it was a steady curation of all these categories, so it's as accurate as I could possibly make it, but it does have its imperfections, like I talked about. So you can see players like Connor McDavid, of course, leading their team, Barkov, Kopitar, Granlund, Eric Stahl's having a great year, so he's up there too, Shea Weber, Roman Yossi, and so on and so forth. I won't go through the whole thing, John Tavares, until we get to Philly, just because. Provorov, Couture, Giroux, Gosses-Perre. So I think that's decently accurate. And then next up, here's the top 50 most valuable players. I was hesitant to switch to this view for one reason, which I'm sure you're thinking about right now. McDavid is not first, Eichel is. And this is an obvious faux pas, as McDavid clearly holds the most value in the league, but Eichel, based on the percentiles, did beat him by 0.7%, beating him by a virtual score of 70.97 to 70.48. And the other thing that stands out right away for me, at least, is Matthew Tkachuk being rated that high. He's the 5th most valuable player and the most valuable winger, which I think is a bit of a stretch. And then 20 players actually have negative value, though this is less to do with their contract, which we typically associate with negative value, but just being an overall bad player. Being old as well, and on maybe not a great contract, but it's more to do with just being an overall bad player. And then next up, we are taking the mean of all the players on every team. So unsurprisingly, the Lightning have the highest overall mean, with the Sabres coming in last. And then the colors organized by median, in which the Vegas Golden Knights have the highest median, and the St. Louis Blues actually have the lowest. And so here's a similar view, except this is with the averages of each specific position. So this gives us a good glimpse as to where teams might look to improve or upgrade. Montreal is, you can't see it, but they're at the very bottom here. And clearly has poor center value, and could look at this and determine, hey, we need to trade for someone with better center value. The Pens have great average center value, so they would, in theory, be able to trade from a position of strength into a position of weakness, maybe defense or right wing. And then finally, this is more fun facts, but standard deviation. The Panthers have the highest deviation amongst player values, followed by the Sabres, with the Chicago Blackhawks having the least, followed by the Devils. All right, so now let's look at some recent player-for-player trades since June that have come out and see which teams, using my empirical model, came out victorious. The trades are mainly player-for-player, but there were a few later round picks that were involved, but the central part was one-for-one, so I just took them out. So we'll start with Sergachev for Drouin. What I'm going to ask you to do, they're going to be pretty obvious, but I'm going to ask you to raise your hand for which team you think won, and then we're going to determine if my model reflects reality being whichever you guys choose. So who do you think won? Tampa. Hands up for Tampa. Okay, that's all I need to see. Yeah, Tampa killed them. Obviously, it was a great trade. Yeah. All right, Everly for Strome. Islanders?
Yeah.
Okay, also, yeah. Yeah, they did win. All right, Panarin for Sad. This one might be a little bit closer. Hands up for Columbus. Okay, nope, all right. Yeah, they killed them again. That was a great trade. There were other moving parts like Forsling, but for the main part, it was just this one-for-one trade. All right, here's a 2-for-2 trade. Marco Scandella, Jason Pominville to the Sabres for Foligno and Ennis. If you think Buffalo won the trade, put your hand up. Uh-oh. And if you think Minnesota won the trade, put your hand up. Okay. All right, so actually both the Buffalo players ended up having more value than the Wild players, so Buffalo did end up winning this trade, according to my model. All right, Enrique for Vatanen. If you think Anaheim won this trade, put your hand up. Okay, wow. And New Jersey? Okay. All right, so the winner was Anaheim, but I'd say it's a win-win because the values are very close, and so yeah, they both got what they wanted. And then Gabrick for Phaneuf, he's a more recent trade. If you think Ottawa won this trade, hands up. Okay. And Los Angeles? Nobody? All right, so LA did win this trade. This sort of reflects reality because Phaneuf has, what, 3 goals and 2 assists in his first 8 games, which is not bad. And Melnyk also won just because he saved a few bucks. All right, so let's look at the deadline deal trades. Let me catch up. So here are the players that were dealt at the trade deadline, actually. So you can see that Brassard tops the list list, followed by the likes of Kane, Nemesnikov, McDonough, Miller, and so on and so forth. Reeves and Bolesky were the only players with historically negative value, though I'd argue that Reeves brings certain value to the Knights, making a cup run. And here are all the players that were traded for first-round picks. I left McDonough and Nash trades out of it just because there were too many other moving parts. But for the most part, this was just dealt for first-round picks. Anyways, it's clear here that Evander King was a great trade for the Sharks, like an amazing trade, and likewise with the Stastny Winnipeg trade. Next comes the Nashville Hartman trade, who is slightly more valuable than Tatar, and still gave up less to get him. And then it was clear that Detroit did get great value for the Tatar trade, who based on this model is the least valuable of the bunch. But like Michael mentioned, Vegas did have the assets to get Tatar, so it might be worth it. And then next up we have third-round picks. That's the other comparison we're going to make today, because there were like a ton of players that were traded for third-round picks this year. There were other other moving parts going different ways, but for the most part, like first-round picks, this was the central part. So we can see from this visual that Maroon has by far the most value, and so in theory was a great trade for the Devils, but they're a bubble playoff team and they bought 2 rentals, Gretner included, so they weren't too happy about this. Moreover, the Holden trade was actually pretty good value for Boston, and then likewise with the Blue Jackets acquiring Ian Cole. The Kempny, Davidson, and Vachernik trades were not quite so good. And so we can look at some potential future trades. We'll do that in the questions if I have time. But yeah, I want to thank you guys for this amazing opportunity to present to you today and be amongst the people who enjoy the analytics of the sport as much as I do. I look forward to meeting you most after this presentation, and I'd be happy to share my ideas further. All right, thank you. Go Flyers.
Yes, we have time for about 2 or 3 questions.
I think a couple people might be interested in if you could put up that Columbus Blue Jackets or this year's one again. Notice VanHAC's pretty high on that.
Wait, the Panarin trade? Oh, VanHAC.
Oh,
sure, yeah. Okay.
There we go.
Screenshots.
One sec, let me go to presenter mode. And then we'll put it in. All right, so it was Thomas VanHAC for, and it was Moat, right?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if Mott is on this actually, just because there were certain things that each player needed to have, so he's not there. I don't know about UC Jokinen. Let's see, he's been on 4 teams this year, so he also might not be there. No, he's not there. So sorry about that. It's a win for Columbus. All right. Yep.
Just in terms of keeping up with the data, like how accurate or how up to date are you able to?
So this, this was from Wednesday actually. I had to get it after the trade deadline just because there was a lot of, I wanted to have that updated. So this is from Wednesday, and then it's just, I can get it fairly easy just through scraping it. So I get it all in like one go, and so yeah. Yep.
Okay, so what kind of like specific variables do you think you want to account for if you're trying to determine a player's trade value at like different times of the year? When you think about the facts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, like I mentioned before, their contract length, that is something I didn't have in this iteration of the model, and that's certainly something to consider, especially at the deadline. Trading for a rental versus a player with 2 more years is obviously going to be a huge difference, for good or for bad. I guess I can factor in like more recent performances as far as trading for players at the deadline. If they're hot, that's obviously more valuable. But yeah, I'm not totally sure. Some other variables.
Thank you very much.